We often hear about the American dream. We see the Statue of Liberty, the skyscrapers of Manhattan, and the sheer force of the most powerful military in human history. But the story of America does not begin with fireworks. It does not begin with a flag on the moon. It begins with blood. It begins with conquest. And it is defined by a painful paradox. How did a loose collection of rebellious colonies manage to become the modern Rome in less than 250 years? How did a nation founded on the ideal that all men are created equal endure centuries of slavery and segregation? To understand where America is going, we have to understand where it came from, and we have to look at the unfiltered truth. This is the entire history of the United States.
1492, Christopher Columbus opened the door to the New World. But we must remember one thing: this land was not empty. For thousands of years, millions of indigenous people lived here, building complex societies and thriving cultures. When the Europeans arrived, the Spanish, the French, and the British, they brought ambition, gunpowder, and something far deadlier: disease. Smallpox and influenza decimated the native populations, clearing a path for European settlement through tragedy. Look at Jamestown in 1607, the first permanent English settlement. It wasn't glorious. It was a nightmare. They chose a swamp. They found no gold. Instead, they found starvation and death. Only through the initial help of the Powhatan tribe did they survive. And then, in 1619, a ship arrived in Virginia that would plant the seed of America's original sin. The first enslaved Africans were brought to the colonies. The institution of slavery began to take root, growing side by side with the hunger for liberty, a bitter irony that would haunt this nation for centuries. By the mid-18th century, North America was a chessboard. The British, French, and Spanish were tearing the continent apart. This culminated in the French and Indian War in 1754, essentially the first true World War. When the smoke cleared in 1763, Britain was victorious. They controlled the continent. But victory came with a heavy price. The king's treasury was empty, and King George III decided that it was time for the colonies to pay the bill.
Taxes. That was the spark. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. The colonists didn't just hate paying, they hated being ignored. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. Tensions boiled over in Boston. Liberty dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. Britain responded with an iron fist, closing the ports. But instead of crushing the rebellion, they united it. On April 19, 1775, at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world was fired. The war was on. But they needed a cause greater than taxes. On July 4, 1776, Thomas Jefferson and the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The words rang out, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The war was impossible on paper. General George Washington led a ragged army against the world's greatest superpower. They froze in Valley Forge. They lost New York, but they refused to die. A miraculous victory at Saratoga in 1777 brought the French into the war. And finally, in 1781 at Yorktown, the British surrendered. A new nation was born. But freedom brought chaos. The first government failed, so in 1787 they wrote the Constitution, creating the system of checks and balances we know today. In 1789, George Washington became the first president.
The 19th century began with a deal of a lifetime. In 1803, Napoleon sold the Louisiana Territory to the U.S., doubling the size of the country overnight. Americans looked west. They believed in manifest destiny, the idea that God had ordained them to own the continent from sea to shining sea. But this expansion was written in blood. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed. Over 60,000 Native Americans were forced from their ancestral homes. The Trail of Tears. Thousands died of cold and hunger on the march. It remains a stain on the national soul. Simultaneously, the U.S. went to war with Mexico in 1846, seizing California, Texas, and the Southwest. The 1849 gold rush sent thousands of dreamers scrambling to the Pacific. But with every new state added to the Union, a deadly question arose. Would this state be free or slave? The North was industrializing. The South relied entirely on the plantation economy and human bondage. The divide was deepening. The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, these were just band-aids on a gaping wound. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected. The South saw his victory as the end of their way of life. They decided they could no longer share a country. They seceded. This was no foreign invasion. This was brother killing brother. The South had the brilliant General Robert E. Lee. The North had industrial might and the sheer willpower of General Ulysses S. Grant. Lincoln changed the purpose of the war. It wasn't just about saving the Union anymore. With the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it became a crusade to end slavery. Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg. These names became graveyards. By the time the South surrendered in 1865, 600,000 Americans were dead. The Union was preserved. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. But tragedy struck the moment peace arrived. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The era of Reconstruction failed. It gave way to Jim Crow laws and the rise of the KKK, plunging African Americans into another century of oppression and terror.
Out of the ashes of war, an industrial titan rose. The Transcontinental Railroad linked the coasts in 1869. The Gilded Age had begun. Titans of industry, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, built empires of oil, steel, and rail. The economy exploded, but so did inequality. The top 10% owned 3/4 of the nation's wealth. Millions of immigrants flooded into Ellis Island, fueling the factories and creating the melting pot of American culture. Cities grew upward with skyscrapers. America was now an economic giant, and it began to look outward. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the U.S. entry into imperialism, taking control of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The giant was waking up.
1914. Europe burst into flames. World War I. At first, America stayed out. But after German submarines sank the Lusitania and threatened alliances in Mexico, President Wilson declared war in 1917. American troops tipped the scales, ending the war in 1918. Back home, the Roaring Twenties brought jazz, Ford automobiles, and prosperity, but the party ended abruptly. 1929. The stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Millions lost their jobs. Banks collapsed. It took President FDR's New Deal to stabilize the bleeding. But what truly ended the Depression was not policy. It was war. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The United States was attacked. The nation mobilized like never before. In Europe, Americans stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, 1944. In the Pacific, they fought a brutal island-hopping campaign against Japan. And then, the moment that changed humanity. August 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 atomic bombs. Over 100,000 dead in an instant. The war ended. The U.S. stood alone at the summit of the world, a nuclear superpower.
Peace was short-lived. An iron curtain fell. The Cold War began, a standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink. But this competition also drove us to the stars. In 1969, America won the space race, putting a man on the moon. At home, a different war was being fought, the war for the soul of America, the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. In 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act finally dismantled legal segregation. But the 60s and 70s also brought the tragedy of Vietnam, a war that divided the nation and ended in a painful withdrawal. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War was over. America stood unrivaled.
The 90s brought the internet revolution and an economic boom, but the 21st century arrived with fire. September 11, 2001, terrorists struck the World Trade Center. The war on terror began, leading to long conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. We saw the Great Recession of 2008. We saw history made with the election of Barack Obama. But recent years have tested the fabric of the nation. Deep political polarization, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the events of January 6, 2021, when the Capitol itself was breached. From 13 small colonies to a global empire of 330 million people, the United States is a nation of contradictions, wealthy yet unequal, free yet divided, modern yet haunted by history. But if history teaches us one thing, it is this: America is resilient. Its strength lies not just in its military, but in its ability to adapt, to reinvent itself, and to strive, however imperfectly, toward a more perfect union. The next chapter of American history is yet to be written, and it will be decided by the people. Thanks for joining this journey through time. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like and subscribe for more history.